When grocery stores were a luxury and money was scarce, farm families had 30 tried-and-true dinners that could feed anyone who showed up at the table.
As far as these boys are concerned, well, hamburgers and hot dogs.
Leftover pan magic. Leftover cornmeal mush became the foundation for a completely different meal the next day. Farm wives never threw away the thick golden mush that remained after breakfast. Instead, they poured it into a loaf pan and let it cool overnight in the cellar until it became firm enough to slice. Transformation began with perfect cornmeal mush preparation the day before. This wasn't thin, watery porridge, but thick, substantial mush that could support a spoon standing upright. The cornmeal had to be stirred constantly during cooking to prevent lumps, creating a smooth golden mass that would hold its shape when cooled. Slicing cold mush and frying it until crispy transformed humble leftovers into something special. Those thick slices hit the hot cast iron skillet with a satisfying sizzle, developing golden crusts that crackled when you bit into them. The outside turned crispy, while the inside stayed creamy and smooth. The slicing technique mattered as much as the cooking. Slices cut too thin would fall apart in the pan, while thick slices wouldn't develop proper crusts. The perfect slice measured about 3/4 of an inch thick, substantial enough to hold together, but thin enough to cook evenly. Sharp knives were essential. Ragged cuts created uneven surfaces that wouldn't brown properly. Cast iron skillets, preheated until water droplets danced across the surface, provided the intense heat needed for proper crusting. A thin layer of bacon grease or lard prevented sticking while adding flavor that complemented the corn's natural sweetness. The first side needed to develop a deep golden crust before flipping. Impatience resulted in torn, uneven surfaces. Sausage syrup made from drippings and a touch of sweetener created the perfect topping. Farm wives saved the fat and brown bits from breakfast sausage, then mixed them with a little molasses or honey. The result was a sweet, savory sauce that made fried mush taste like dessert. Creating sausage syrup required understanding the balance between sweet and savory elements. Too much sweetener made it cloying, while too little left it just greasy. Brown bits from the sausage, those caramelized proteins and fats, provided the complex flavors that elevated simple drippings into something worth saving. This technique proved that farm families never truly had leftovers, just ingredients for tomorrow's meal. What looked like waste became the star of the next day's breakfast or supper, depending on when hunger struck. The timing flexibility made fried mush perfect for unpredictable farm schedules. Fried mush slices had crispy outsides and creamy centers that satisfied both texture and flavor cravings. Every bite delivered contrasts that made simple cornmeal feel exciting. Sausage syrup balanced sweet and savory flavors in a way that made breakfast feel like dessert. Leftover transformation was an art form that farm wives mastered out of necessity and perfected through practice. They understood that creativity could turn yesterday's breakfast into today's treat. Leftover pan meals represented the ultimate victory of creativity over waste. End of season salvation. When the garden season ended, smart farm wives saved every scrap in the freezer for one final feast. Those plastic bags accumulated throughout the harvest months. A handful of green beans here, some corn kernels there, carrot tops that were too good to throw away. The collection process started in midsummer when the first vegetables reached maturity. Every time a farm wife prepared vegetables for canning or fresh eating, the scraps went into labeled freezer bags. Beet greens too tender for the compost, corn kernels cut from imperfect cobs, green beans with slight blemishes that wouldn't look perfect in canning jars. Everything edible found its way into those accumulating bags. Organization became crucial as the bags multiplied. Smart cooks labeled each bag with contents and dates. understanding that some vegetables would contribute better flavors than others. Root vegetable peelings provided earthy depth, while herb trimmings added complexity that elevated simple vegetable scraps into sophisticated soup bases. Kettle soup, made from freezer bag ends, transformed vegetable scraps into a satisfying meal that could feed the whole family. Farm wives emptied every bag into their biggest pot, creating combinations that changed with each batch, depending on what the season had provided. This wasn't garbage soup. It was the concentrated essence of an entire growing season. Every spoonful contained the memory of July tomatoes, August corn, September beans, and October carrots. Flavors told the story of months spent tending, harvesting, and preserving. The cooking process required intuition developed over years of similar soup making. Heartier vegetables like carrot chunks and potato pieces went in first, needing longer cooking times to become tender. Leafy greens and herb trimmings waited until the final minutes, preserving their bright flavors and preventing them from disappearing into mush. Seasoning end-of-season soup challenged even experienced cooks, because every batch contained different combinations of vegetables. The soup might be predominantly corn-flavored one year, heavy with tomato the next. Every spoonful contained the memory of July tomatoes, August corn, September beans, and October carrots. The flavors told the story of months spent tending, harvesting, and preserving. The cooking process required intuition developed over years of similar soup making. Heartier vegetables like carrot chunks and potato pieces went in first, needing longer cooking times to become tender. Leafy greens and herb trimmings waited until the final minutes, preserving their bright flavors and preventing them from disappearing into mush. Seasoning end-of-season soup challenged even experienced cooks, because every batch contained different combinations of vegetables. The soup might be predominantly corn-flavored one year, heavy with tomato the next. Each batch required tasting and adjusting, building flavor layers that would complement whatever vegetables dominated that particular harvest. Every vegetable that was too small to preserve individually found its purpose in the season-end kettle. Those few green beans that didn't fill a canning jar, the corn kernels cut from cobs with blemishes, the beet greens that were too tender to waste. Everything had value in this final celebration. The variety of vegetables created complex flavors that couldn't be achieved with any single ingredient. Each pot was different because each garden produced its own unique combination of abundance and oddments. This unpredictability became part of the soup's charm. No two batches would ever taste exactly the same. Farm families looked forward to this soup because it tasted like the memory of summer abundance concentrated into one warming bowl. Nothing edible was ever wasted when creative cooks could transform scraps into satisfying meals. End-of-season soup represented the perfect closure to months of gardening and preserving work. Barn shift sustenance. Late-night barn shifts during calving season required food that could be eaten quickly and quietly. When cows were ready to deliver, someone had to check on them every few hours through the night. These midnight meals had to fuel exhausted farmers without waking the whole household. Calving season stretched from February through April, when temperatures could drop below zero and winds cut through multiple layers of clothing. The physical demands of checking pregnant cows, assisting difficult births, and caring for newborn calves in harsh conditions required fuel that would sustain energy through long, cold hours of outdoor work. SOS on baking powder biscuits provided the protein and carbohydrates needed for long, cold nights. That creamed chipped beef on hot biscuits delivered everything a tired body needed: salt, fat, protein, and filling starches that would sustain energy through hours of barn work. The military heritage of SOS, dried beef on toast, known by soldiers as same old stuff, or more colorful variations, made it perfect for farm emergency feeding. Originally designed to provide maximum nutrition with shelf-stable ingredients, it adapted perfectly to farm life where midnight hunger struck without warning and convenience foods didn't exist. Preparation had to be fast enough for someone operating on 2 hours of sleep, but substantial enough to fuel hard physical labor. The cream sauce started with bacon grease or butter. Flour whisked in to create a roux, then milk added gradually to prevent lumps. Dried beef, torn into bite-sized pieces, went in just long enough to heat through without becoming tough. Baking powder biscuits were faster than yeast bread, but still provided the foundation for a substantial meal. Mixed, rolled, and baked in under 30 minutes, these biscuits emerged from the oven light, fluffy, and capable of soaking up every drop of the creamy sauce without falling apart. Garden pickles on the side added the bright acidity that cut through rich, creamy flavors. Those tangy cucumber slices preserved in vinegar provided the sharp contrast that made heavy comfort food feel balanced and complete instead of overwhelming. The pickle choice mattered. Sweet pickles would fight with the savory cream sauce. Barn shift meals had to be portable, satisfying, and able to provide sustained energy. The combination could be eaten with one hand while holding a lantern with the other. No fancy plates or utensils required, just substantial food that could be consumed standing up in the kitchen before heading back outside. The portability factor couldn't be ignored. Sometimes calving emergencies required eating while walking to the barn or wolfing down food between checking different groups of cattle. Everything had to stay together without making a mess or requiring 2 hands to manage. SOS was military-inspired comfort food that farm families adapted for their own demanding schedules. The creamed beef mixture traveled well and reheated easily, making it perfect for unpredictable barn duty timing. Baking powder biscuits were faster than yeast bread, but still provided the foundation for a substantial meal. Homemade pickles preserved the garden's brightness for times when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Barn shift dinners proved that even the most challenging work schedules could include satisfying, nourishing food that honored both necessity and taste. Puller's picnic perfection. When neighbors gathered to pull stumps or raise barns, the meal had to be special enough to thank volunteers for their backbreaking labor. Farm families understood that community cooperation required proper hospitality. You couldn't ask for help without offering something worthy in return. Cold roast beef with horseradish cream represented the finest hospitality that honored hard-working helpers. This combination showed neighbors they were valued members of the community whose time and sweat deserved recognition. The cold presentation made it practical for outdoor serving while maintaining an air of elegance. This wasn't everyday food. It was the best the farm could offer to show appreciation for community cooperation. Farm wives saved their finest cuts of beef for these occasions, knowing that reputation in farming communities traveled fast. Cheap food meant cheap gratitude. Cold roast beef required advanced planning and the best cut the family could afford. The meat had to be cooked perfectly the day before, then chilled overnight to achieve the right texture for slicing. No shortcuts could be taken when the community was watching. Horseradish cream provided the sharp bite that elevated simple roast beef into something memorable. Fresh horseradish root was grated and mixed with cream to create a sauce that cleared sinuses and made simple beef taste sophisticated. That fiery kick separated this meal from ordinary fare. The preparation ritual began before dawn on workdays. Farm wives would rise early to slice the chilled beef paper thin, arrange it on their best platters, and prepare fresh batches of horseradish cream. Every slice had to be perfect because imperfect food reflected poorly on the entire family's reputation. Puller's picnic meals had to be impressive enough to ensure neighbors would return when help was needed again. The combination was elegant enough for company, but practical enough to serve outdoors. Community work meals represented the social bonds that held farming communities together. Friday night tradition. Friday night meant fish, and salmon patties were the affordable way to honor that tradition. Farm families who couldn't afford fresh fish found a solution in those tall cans of pink salmon that sat on pantry shelves year-round. Canned salmon became crispy, golden patties that satisfied fish cravings without breaking the budget. Farm wives mixed the flaked salmon with breadcrumbs and eggs, then shaped them into patties that sizzled in hot cast-iron skillets. The outside developed a golden crust, while the inside stayed moist and flaky. The art of salmon patties lay in the proportions. Too much filler made them taste like breadcrumbs. Too little made them fall apart in the pan. Experienced cooks knew to drain the salmon thoroughly, removing every bit of liquid that could make the mixture too wet. The best patties held together without being dense, crispy without being dry. Creamed peas provided the rich, comforting side that made this simple meal feel complete. Those bright green peas, whether fresh from the garden or frozen from the previous season, simmered in cream sauce that balanced the salty salmon perfectly. The cream sauce was never thick enough to mask the peas' sweetness, but rich enough to coat each one with velvety smoothness. Vinegar slaw added the bright, tangy crunch that balanced the rich salmon and creamy peas. Farm wives shredded cabbage from the garden and dressed it with vinegar and a touch of sugar, creating a crisp contrast to the warm, creamy elements on the plate. The slaw had to be made fresh for each meal. Yesterday's wilted cabbage wouldn't provide the sharp crunch that made the combination work. Friday fish dinners connected farm families to religious traditions, even when fresh fish wasn't available. The Catholic practice of eating fish on Fridays meant families needed affordable options that could feed everyone without requiring trips to distant fish markets. Salmon patties democratized the Friday fish tradition, making it accessible to families far from oceans or rivers. The Friday night ritual became something children looked forward to. The sizzle of patties in the skillet, the smell of creamed peas bubbling on the stove, the sharp tang of fresh slaw cutting through rich flavors. These sensory memories would follow them long after they left the farm. Salmon patties proved that canned fish could be transformed into something that felt special and deliberate. The combination of textures, crispy patties, creamy peas, crunchy slaw, made this meal memorable enough to become a weekly tradition. Company night excellence. When special company came to dinner, farm wives brought out their finest ingredients and best techniques. The good china came down from the high shelf, and the best cuts of meat came up from the cellar. This wasn't the time for everyday meals or shortcuts. Chuck roast with pressure-canned green beans represented the pinnacle of farm family hospitality. That tender roast had been selected carefully from the best part of the beef, while the green beans came from jars that had been processed at the peak of summer freshness. Company meals required days of preparation. The roast had to be chosen weeks ahead when the beef was butchered, then aged properly in the cold cellar. The green beans had been selected at their peak of tenderness, processed in small batches to ensure perfect texture and color. Every element on the company plate represented months of planning and the best the farm could produce. The roast itself demanded perfect timing, slow cooked until fork tender but not falling apart, seasoned with herbs from the kitchen garden and presented whole before carving at the table. This wasn't pot roast chopped up and served family style. This was restaurant presentation that showed guests they were worth the extra effort. Pressure-canned green beans retained more color and texture than other preservation methods. Those bright green beans looked like they had just been picked from the garden. not stored in jars for months. The pressure canning process kept them firm and flavorful in ways that water bath canning couldn't achieve. Farm wives took pride in green beans that looked fresh in February, proof of their skill in preservation. The onions cooked with the beans added sweetness that complemented the rich, tender roast. Those caramelized onions had absorbed the beef drippings while adding their own mellow flavor to every forkful of vegetables. The timing had to be perfect. Onions added too early would disappear into mush, too late would remain sharp and raw. Company presentations extended beyond the food itself. The table was set with the wedding china and good silverware, cloth napkins replaced everyday paper, and candles provided warm light that made everyone look their best. The dining room table, reserved for special occasions, replaced the everyday kitchen table where the family usually gathered. Company night dinners required advanced planning and the willingness to use the best preserved foods. This meal demonstrated that farm families could create restaurant-quality food from their own resources. Company night excellence proved that hospitality was measured not in expense, but in care and attention to quality. These 30 forgotten dinners represent more than just meals. They're a masterclass in resourcefulness that built America. Every dish tells the story of families who understood that creativity and skill mattered more than expensive ingredients. Farm wives transformed tough cuts into tender feasts, stretched scarce meat with garden vegetables, and created comfort from whatever the land provided. They knew that feeding people well meant more than just filling stomachs. It meant creating memories and traditions that held communities together. Share your memories of these forgotten feasts in the comments below. Help keep these incredible traditions alive for the next generation.